This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. I think there's been a little bit of a shifting trend that I think I'm noticing online. It might be kind of my bias, and what I end up seeing happening is sort of not necessarily a reflection of the real world, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts as well. So I think if you think back sort of through eras of music, there was like the 60s where there was guitar straight to amp, maybe a couple of pedals into the 70s when these things started getting created. And then in the 80s, I think there was a professional kind of touring musician. There was a propensity for huge rack units, right? And this was a thing for a while, right? You'd have these massive kind of things. You've seen like John Petrucci, you've seen, I think it's the Bradshaw rig, right? Steve Lukather, folks like this. And at some point, the rack unit sort of went away a bit, right? After this kind of rack thing, I think what started to happen is you started to get sort of a little bit of a miniaturization, or a bit more of a practical rig, where people had sort of, again, going back more towards the pedalboard thing. And then from there, I think we saw the pedalboard kind of grow and grow and grow until you see these people with these massive kind of pedalboards, or maybe even two pedalboards sometimes, with a whole myriad of different pedals on there. I think what we're starting to see again now is sort of the shrinkage of the pedalboard, a bit of shrinkage. And I think there's probably a few reasons for this, but what made me think of this was Tim Pierce's latest video, where he had on this board an LVX, he had a TC Electronics plethora, and he had a few other little bits and pieces, but the board is definitely, I think, smaller than potentially you've seen in the past. And what's happening as well is that you've got multi-effects creeping onto there. And now in his video, actually I don't know whether Tim knows that you've got a tuner on the LVX, but he sticks a tuner in the middle of the board. But also he's got a halo, a Keeley halo, he's got the Meris LVX, he's got the TC plethora, and sort of like a Boss tremolo, some other bits and pieces. And I wonder if like the logical next step from there, to me, and Tim is a guy who has, you know, access to things like the Fractal FM3 and stuff, for people that are genuinely flying loads and using these things, to me it seems to make a lot of sense, especially if you've made the jump from individual effects towards multi-effects, or, you know, this is a multi-effects, isn't it, essentially, and so is the TC plethora, to go fully into the digital world, or more, dive deeper into it. And what we're seeing, I think you see more and more boards where it's just like a quad cortex and maybe a couple of drive pedals. I've seen that a lot. Or maybe just a quad cortex and like a drop pedal. I see that quite a lot in the Neural DSP pages. The Fractal Axe 8, I think, was one of the first times where I started to see like genuine touring musicians going out with just that thing. There's people out there just touring the Helix. Tom Quayle was a user of the HX effects by itself, with maybe his dual fusion for a fly rig. So I think maybe we're going to get to this sort of stage where people are really paring back this thing on, where people are really paring back their boards again. So I've got a friend Jake as well. He's got quite a large board that is in his room. He doesn't even gig it anymore because he's got like a much smaller board that he actually takes out in gigs. I think there's this trend again going away, and like I said, over the years you have these massive rack things which, you know, people follow, I guess, these guitar heroes, and they sort of follow their lead in a lot of ways. I guess those are the trendsetters. And so once you see these things creeping up on people's boards or things like this, so this, I guess you could think about as like a multi-drive or something like a Strine and Sunset or whatever. But the idea being that you're sort of packing a lot of things into one unit, and more on bass players' boards I'm seeing the HX Stomp XL creep up, so like Yannick Wisdala, Henrik Linder, I think Chris Buck has one of these on his board as well. So these are getting out there. I think people are getting used to the idea, I think, or getting more used to the idea of maybe having something with a screen on it, maybe digging into menus, and, you know, like the excitement around the Eventide H90. So I think we might be entering the era of the multi-effects. We might be entering the era of the all-in modeler even. And actually, I think even modeling is slightly behind the plugin industry, where if you look at something like the Timeless 3, which Sergio drew my attention to from FabFilter, that to me looks like what the future of sound design and the future of effects and stuff might look like. And so that's interesting to me. Let me know your thoughts. Are you less interested in all of these like individual pedal things? I feel like, for me at least, I'm seeing a little bit less interest and a little bit more skepticism about potentially kind of just one-off boutique kind of pedals. I think people are possibly more open to the idea of having one thing that does lots of things than ever before. And, you know, things like, obviously, a multi-effects as a concept is not necessarily new. You know, you had the DL4, which for sure made it onto people's boards years ago. But when you look at the most mentioned pedals on Reddit, for example, was something that someone drew my attention to yesterday, you see there is more of this sort of stuff creeping on there. And, you know, even like Chase Bliss effects in general, I think you could think of as a multi-effects in a way. So this idea of the workstation, instead of just a basic kind of one function pedal, the idea of the workstation pedal with a user interface, I think that seems to be the trend of where things are headed. Or you got things like, well, I mean, Boss are doing the simpler stuff as well as the more complicated stuff as well, right? Feel like the era of the massive pedalboard might be coming to a close, and we might be coming back towards this idea of something closer to, you know, a miniaturized board, maybe, and maybe even some people are actually able to gig plugins, which is, to me, an idea that I've not got my head around yet, but I think it could be a cool thing. Let me know your thoughts. Is it the era of the multi-effect? The single function pedals, are they going to be going? Except for maybe your holy grail one, so maybe you have individual drives that you think, right, well, that is my drive tone. So for me, like the J-Rocket Dude or the Pete Cornish NG2. But as it pertains to actual sound design and coming up with stuff, for me, the multi-effect or the modeler, I think, is mainly where my attention would go, I think. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. So let me know your thoughts. Have you got any of these on your boards? There is, I think, a downside to some of this. So things like the HX Stomp are very difficult to power with normal kind of power supplies. You have to kind of have quite a lot of juice going through it, and also you need a couple of different adapters. The Chase Bliss thing, 500 milliamps, is a little bit keen. It doesn't say what the draw on the LVX is. So that's one of the slight negatives. And then the other slight negative that you'd have to think about maybe is that it takes quite a lot of time to program these things in. So if you had more than one of these multi-effects units and you're trying to get them to talk to one another, so for instance, I think David Beebe mentioned someone was trying to program an Axe with a Boss ES5 or something like that, things start to get a little bit complicated. So for me, if I was going to be using sort of 1, 2, 3 or 4 sort of multi-effecty modern things, I probably would just make the jump and say, right, well, I'm going to commit myself to one unit, because for sure, if you're just programming in Fractal, for sure, if you're just programming in Helix, it's a lot easier, I find, and a lot less time consuming than trying to, you know, plan out these MIDI messages and all this stuff and get things speaking to each other and cross-talking. For me, personally, I don't know if you feel similarly, if I'm going to go down the route of some multi-effects, I'd rather, I think, not end up combining loads together and instead just put it all into one unit, whether that would be a Fractal or a Helix or whatever. I think once you start to make the leap into this multi-effects thing, then you kind of are already in. You might as well go digital.